Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Derek Lambert from MythVision podcast, and today we're going to be discussing why we both believe that the crucifixion of Jesus historically makes sense. Welcome to the show, Derek. Been a while since I had you here.
Hey, thanks, Jacob. I appreciate it. My internet seems to be a little bit fuzzy right now. Bear
That's all
with
right.
me. I'm sure it's going to get better. I'm simply trying to upload the video that we were just trying to test. But I
Yeah,
really appreciate you having me on, man. It's been a minute.
yeah, it has. So I want to start with you first. When when you when you went for your journey, um, going from believing or leaning towards mythicism to becoming a historicist, what led you down to that path to becoming a historicist?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think when you start from where I was, everything was, inerrant, infallible. You go from like, I really believe there were no errors or problems with the Bible to realizing you've been kind of fooled into thinking this is literally true and everything written in it is literally true. Once you discover, and I kind of want to paint the picture, I guess, for me, once you discover there are a lot of this is like, whoa, this is not true. Jesus didn't do that. In fact, seems very fanciful. And then when you look at comparative religion or you look to compare, you kind of go, other people did similar things. They don't have to be identical, but similar. And you've already accepted that those were legendary. You've seen that that's not the case. So then you get to Jesus and you start realizing, oh, snap, he couldn't have existed because this didn't happen, right? You start looking at particular details, whether he's walking on water or you find um, turning water into wine, you see Dionysus, or whatever it might be. You start to kind of compare and go, hold on, this seems very mythical. Then you get to Jesus and you go, well, he didn't do that. This is fanciful narrative. And in my mind, it was really simple to go, none of this is true because I was already astrotheology type mythicist. I thought maybe this is all an allegory about the sun, moon, and stars. And so none of this is historical. Even if they're trying to dress the furniture up like it looks historical, it's not historical. None of it is. And I think it was simple to go from an extreme to full on extreme mythicism in that respect. As time has gone by, and I've been studying mythicism and, of course, other arguments for historicism, I've refined and became more educated. There are things that I value, I must admit. There are things you learn from mythicism that help you sharpen your tools on maybe getting closer to Jesus or understanding early Christianity. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater or go into any extreme in my position today either. But I'd say some of the things that really led me to start thinking there was a guy is over the years, I've interviewed Robert Price, I've interviewed Richard Carrier, and those who are mythicists. And when I ask about crucifixion, there's not one answer from a mythicist. That doesn't mean they're wrong. But one of the answers I've gotten from Robert Price, for example, is that this is a celestial, you could say that there's what is it, the specific uh, constellations that align in the celestial plane or something to this effect, where he's trying to explain it in astrotheology terms. That may be because he helped edit the Acharya S book. And so maybe he has some overlay from that. And he's convinced that when Paul talks about Jesus is crucified, maybe he thinks there's something there. And I've asked this question over the last 2.5 years. What does Paul mean when he says Christ was crucified? Buried, resurrected, the whole nine, that this might be some celestial thing for him. For Richard Carrier, it was, this is a real person in the mind of Paul and in the early Christians who actually was crucified and really gets buried and really gets resurrected in a real physical body up there in heaven. And so for me, this is where the rubber hits the road of the question today and the title of this show. And Jacob, I don't know if you share with me on this, and that's fine if you don't. In fact, I love my mythicist friends. I learn from them. I try my best to be open-minded. But in this particular view, if you had overwhelming evidence, Jacob, that said and clearly specified Jesus was crucified in heaven or in outer space, or, born in heaven or made in heaven, right? So of a woman from the sperm of David in heaven. These are some of the things that if I was, and I think I told you this yesterday on the phone when we were just hanging out, talking about what we might discuss today. If I said to you, someone was dunked on, I know this is a bad analogy, using basketball, for example, someone was dunked on, or they got crossed over, or they did an alley-oop, or they did a three-point shot. I wouldn't need to tell you that's on Earth. I wouldn't need to say, oh, by the way, basketball here on planet Earth, here in like this plane, below the moon, in this realm. I don't need to tell you that. I would need to tell you if I'm talking about Space Jam, if I'm referring to another dimension or realm where Michael Jordan enters and plays with aliens to fight their team and win the basketball goal. If I don't have that clearly spelled out, that this basketball game is happening in Space Jam in a whole nother realm, somewhere completely different, it is automatically assumed and easily understood to be mundane and here on the plane of Earth. There is no reason to draw the celestial, birth or the celestial crucifixion when we have sandwiched before and after. If you look at this like a sandwich, Paul is the meat, the pickles, and the lettuce, whatever. Josephus is one bun and Philo is another bun. And the examples of crucifixion, when they use the same term, crucified and being crucifixion and such, to Jews, which Paul says Jesus was a Jew, it was Romans that were doing this, and they had a fetish, as Paula Fredrickson has said countless times on my interviews, with crucifying Jews. This is like saying, hey, this guy, by his enemies, got slam dunked on. You don't run to heaven or Space Jam unless clearly specified. It seems very common and ubiquitous. When I say they got dunked on, you're going to refer to a basketball game that happened in this realm that we live in today here. Unless it is clearly and explicitly stated elsewhere or anywhere in the literature detailing this event, I'm going to start with the obvious. You have to read into it, in my view. And that's why mythicism, one of the many things that for me makes me not buy into the Doherty position of mythicism. I want to say something in favor of mythicists for one moment. They're correct in many ways, even in their terms for like when Paul uses ginomai, right? He is talking about made. However, and we'll pull up some examples here on the screen in just a moment. My buddy Stephen Nelson, he looks deep into this stuff, and I really like to learn some of the Greek stuff from him. But Plutarch has something to say about this as well, and so there are many references to look at this. This idea to be made doesn't mean not birth. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be both. In fact, there are times where there are demigods that are birthed by mortal women, and they also, if you will, there's the incarnation of Jesus while you have a birth, right? So you have kind of both. The pre-existent Christ becomes incarnated, simultaneously he is birthed at the same time. So you don't need to run to, if it's made, it means that he wasn't born, of the sperm of David and such. The good positive thing I want to say about the mythicists is this. If mythicism in some form or is true, if there is a true position on this for me, it's not the celestial model. It would mean that Paul believes, and the early Christians believe, in my view, that sometime in the not too distant past, a man named Jesus or Christ, they call him the Messiah, came to be in this realm that he was at and was crucified. So I don't take the celestial model. It would need to be a historical fiction at best that he was here on Earth. I'll give you an example. Romulus, right? Romulus seems to have a lot of overlap. Richard C. Miller's written on this in his Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity book. But when you look at Romulus, he comes all the way to Earth. He, founds Rome, a kingdom, which I think Jesus is competing in some way. In the book of Acts is competing with the Roman Empire, competing with Virgil. If you read Dennis R. MacDonald's work, I think Mark is also doing that. Robin Faith Walsh discusses this as well, and she has an article coming out soon. This is on Earth. You also have the thrust of the Gospels, even though I think they're highly fictional. And I don't know if we can walk away from the Gospels saying this is historical or that actually happened or Jesus really said that. I'm agnostic on knowing if there's anything that really goes back with any confidence or certainty from the Gospel narratives. But the fact that they have him on earth and paint this fictional picture of him on earth, I don't know why we're running to heaven. You see what I'm trying to get at? So let's just grant mythicism were true. I would take a historical model instead of a celestial plane one. And it would need to be at some point on earth, they thought he existed and yada, 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 not in heaven. Sorry for the long-winded rambling there, but I've done quite a bit of thinking on this. And this is my personal take, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I understand. And I remember way back then when I started out on this, I always assumed that there was a guy, but in a weird way, I kind of got mythicism and historicism kind of lumped over. Because to me, the way I looked at it a few years ago is, well, if the biblical Jesus, if the historical Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then in a way, we're saying Jesus didn't exist, at least as described in the Bible. So back then, before I knew as much as I know now, before I came to know as much as I know now, I confused mythicism with historicism because I didn't really see much of a difference. Later, I would realize, okay, they are far more different than I thought. And I wondered if, just like you are now, if anything in the Gospels could be traced back to a historical Jesus, or event of crucifixion. There are some scholars that point out the things that sound Jewish, sayings of Jesus in the Gospels that sound Jewish, they can't even be certain of that. Goes back to historical Jesus, and they might have added that material into Jesus's character later for whatever reason. But it looks like we lost him for a moment there. Oh, here he is. He's back.
Sorry, man. I'm trying to get this thing right so I don't.
That's okay. Yeah.
Does it look better now than it did, or is it still bad?
It's still grainy, not as grainy, but still pretty grainy. No,
I don't know why it's doing that, man.
I know. I hate
Let
it.
Let me cancel this upload. I was trying to get that thing fixed so that we could have it. Is it any better now, by any chance?
No, it's the same.
Jeez. Okay. I'm trying, bro.
Yeah, well, it's okay. We might have to just muddle through it and share it directly through StreamYard, despite the fact it kind of lagged. But
okay,
we might have no choice there. But to finish my thought, I want to respond to the Romulus thing. I'm not so positive if Romulus is an example of someone that didn't exist from my point of view. There's a while back there was a defense wall that was found in Rome. I remember reading about this, and it's located in about the same place that the myth claims Remus had it built, because it was Remus's defense wall. According to the Roman myth, Remus is the first person to build a defense wall in Rome, from what I remember. And Romans were often ancestor worshippers. That's something that we can't forget. And I don't really have a problem with the idea, personally, that Romulus was deified. And what happened is, as he got heavily mythologized, a belief came to exist that he descended from heaven. I don't think saying that somebody descended from heaven clearly shows somebody didn't exist. I think it was a exaggeration that was added to him. So that's why I don't agree with mythicists that he's an example, a clear example of someone not existing.
It really, to me, and can you hear me clearly? I want to make sure.
I do.
Okay.
In fact, the quality is a lot better now, as a matter of fact.
Okay, good. It wouldn't matter to me whether he did or didn't exist.
Yeah.
I make the point, assuming he didn't, let's just say,
Sure.
that he obviously is a model of somebody who comes to Earth. And much of the mythology that I find, Richard C. Miller's book, is one I keep referring to because I just recently read that thing through and through, and it's really such a good book. I left a review on Amazon. I hope to do that more often with the scholars I read, but he shows that the New Testament and even Paul, the earliest church fathers, the New Testament Gospels, Paul himself, he has a son of God of noble bloodline. He's claiming him from the seed of David, competition son of God to the obviously Julio-Claudian and the Roman versions that are floating around, Greek and Roman ideas. And he models this. This is kind of modeled after the Greek and Roman world. And if I look at the Greek and Roman world, I'm seeing Julius Caesar, I'm seeing Caesar Augustus, I see Romulus. Let's just say there's a little existent, non-existent historical figures that seem to have existed, at least in the eyes and minds of those who are reading this material in the Greek and Roman world. And Jesus gets modeled in many ways off of this. I mean, you wouldn't have Jesus floating up in a cloud in Acts chapter 1 if you weren't trying to say, hey, our guy is better than your guy. You use what is the topos, the tradition. And you'd say the same thing for Moses. We all know when we read our Bibles, Moses dies and wasn't allowed into the promised land. Okay. So God buries him, or he gets buried somehow. It seems to imply God buries him, or at least in some way make sure he's taken care of and he gets buried. Josephus and Philo have him have an apotheosis and is taken up. Now, the only reason you would do that is you're modeling it after the larger empire. And so it seems fitting that I would need more models if we're going to do I'm going back to a Doherty hypothesis here. I would need more contemporaneous models that fit a celestial figure who only comes down to a third heaven, who only remains there, never goes to earth, only stays in outer space, and then goes back up to the seventh heaven in outer space, but never comes to earth. I don't have enough of that. It's, again, the Space Jam basketball analogy. And if I had a lot of that, I would be sitting there going, hold on, maybe this guy is a complete fiction in the minds of these people. Mind you, I do think if you take Paul as a diviner type, like a person who is a mystical person, I do think he's having some mystical hallucination, some mystical personal experience with this Jesus, as he calls him, the Christ. But I don't think that is like, oh, well, that means there was not a guy at all. You see what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah.
And mythicists have an upper hand in a sense because we have such horrible data on Jesus coming from a guy who never met him and is having these hallucinatory, revelatory, I'll call them, experiences with Jesus. So it's like, you got a good point to make here. Assuming he doesn't know anything about this Christ, though, and he got everything from Scripture and Revelation, is also a fundamentalist position, in my opinion, that, fundamentalists go to the full extreme. The whole Bible's inerrant, infallible, literal. Like,
right.
Why was he in his own letters persecuting Christians? He had to know what they were believing or teaching, or he wouldn't be persecuting them. So exactly. You have to know their position. So to act like there was in the real world, people think if you're a Muslim, you think Gabriel really gave the revelations to Muhammad in a cave. If you're someone like us, you go, actually, there's probably oral transmission of stories going down in Arabia. We don't really have evidence of the text existing, but definitely stories about Jesus, stories about Mary and Moses and Joshua, you name it, the conquest, all of that, Genesis, Adam, Eve, etc. But there seems to be also some Gnostic traditions that float their way in, making a clay bird into life. That's more of a historical approach, right? Well, if we look at Paul says, I received none of this from man, meaning I'm not here to please man. I'm his non-circumcision message. He got this from, divine revelation in Scripture. You have to believe what Paul is saying and actually say he didn't learn anything from anyone else. I don't believe that Paul only learned everything he ever talks about with Christ from revelation in Scripture only. That, to me, using a historical method, I would say this guy had to know something about the earlier movements before him. That's why he persecuted them. He had to know something about the Christ, and something happened where he ends up switching teams. Simple.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to claim that Paul invented the crucifixion of Jesus, made it up, because if you look at, even if you just believe in only 7 of them and you claim that the other 6 of the 13 Pauline epistles, because Hebrews is not a Pauline epistle, you think that 6 of them out of 13 are not authentic, pseudepigraphy. Paul in 1 Thessalonians blames the Jews for Jesus' death. He says that the wrath came upon them for what they had done to Jesus. And in 1 and 2 Corinthians, vague archons, earthly archons, not heavenly, are behind the death of Jesus. And to me, it sounds like, in at least in those contexts, he's avoiding naming the Romans directly as being behind the crucifixion of Jesus. To me, the crucifixion is a problem that Paul is trying to work around, but he can't. And he wants to avoid naming the Romans, so he names anybody but them, if you get what I'm saying. Because Jews don't crucify people. Maybe in Alexander Jannaeus' time they did, but Jesus didn't live in that time, unless you want to stick with the fringe position that he's the Jesus of the Talmud that lived a century earlier or two. Because there's another Jesus in there that lived even earlier than that, 2nd century BCE. But I don't buy that. I think this is somebody else. So that's one of my biggest problems with mythicism is, why is Paul trying to blame one group over here or this other group over here, depending on which letter you read, because he's trying to avoid fingering the Romans.
Right.
Like,
I mean, look at Revelation. He talks about the mark of the beast. Let them who has wisdom, calculate. And of course, Christians find loopholes to escape the problem of this being Nero, being a 1st century document that's trying to deal with stuff soon, which means it failed. But they find a way to escape it. Why would this author be writing in code? I mean, do you not think that they would be killed if they did name Romans and clearly were making the point? So maybe, and I don't know. I mean, a lot of this is speculative. In fact, this is the one jab mythicists have, and I don't knock it. Give me the evidence. Give me the proof. Give me the guy. Show me the guy. If you can't prove the guy existed, then he didn't exist. Therefore, I'm certain he didn't exist. That's not a good argument to me either. I would be much more minimalist in my approach and say the evidence, if I look at the whole picture and I backed up, I can walk hand in hand with mythicists like a long, long ways in this talk. Sure, a lot of this is legend. Even in Paul, I go as far as to say I think the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is already a legend. You have a son of God. You have eyewitness testimonies. And I gave quotations because Romulus had eyewitness testimony. Other Caesars had eyewitness testimony. All you got to do is read one apology with Justin Martyr, and he literally equates the Jesus movement with the other sons of Zeus. He says, hey, you guys had sons of Zeus. He goes further and then says also like those Caesars. And then he emphasizes, hey, you guys have eyewitnesses that come and say that they saw them have an apotheosis, that the Caesars became deified. Like, hey, we believe nothing different about our Christ. So Paul already, in my view, has a mythological or a legendary Christology, if that makes sense, or a topos that is legendary about Jesus. So you're already dealing with someone just a few decades, not even after the time we would say this guy existed, who's already legendary. And Richard C. Miller says in his book that it sometimes, in some of the cases with the Caesars, when they died, 2 or 3 days after their death, they're already coming up with apotheosis legends. They're already creating stuff up. So no matter what you do, you kind of should be open-minded and flexible. When I'm looking at the language, born of a woman of the seed of David, or even made, right? Let's use the word to mean make or come into being. It can be both. And here's the example. I'm going to share my screen real quick here to give you, Plutarch has something to say on this. And I just shared it. So this is thanks to my buddy Stephen Nelson, who's a Greek guru. And I am going to butcher if I try to go on the right side here and explain any of this material. But I'm just going to read this. Why ever did he call the supreme God Father and maker of all things? Notice Father and maker. He color codes this. I love Stephen. Bright mind, someone worth listening to. Was it because he is of gods, the gods that are engendered, and of men, father, as Homer names him, but maker of irrational beings and of inanimate things? For not even of the placenta, says Chrysippus, though it is a product of the seed. Is he who provided the seed called father? Or is it by his customary use of metaphor that he has called him who is responsible for the universe its father? So in the Symposium, he called Phaedrus father of the amatory discourses, because he was instigator of them. And in the dialogue that bears his name, called him blessed with fair children, because as a result of his initiative, philosophy had been filled with many fair discourses. Or is there, notice this part, is there a difference between father and maker? In the Greek, there's the two terms for to come into being or to be birthed, right? To be born. And between birth and coming to be. So this idea, it's corresponding to the color codes that he's putting here. For as what has been born has ipso facto come to be, but not contrariwise. So a thing that is born can also be something that has come into being. It could come into being. You could use the term it came into being. But it also could be something that was born. But if a god came into being, not all gods were birthed. Not all gods were born. So the point is you can be born and come into being, but you can't come into being and be born because you already came into being. You don't need to be birthed. So this is where the whole demigod stories of impregnating women and getting them born and such, this is where you'd find this trope. So it is that he has begotten, has ipso facto made. For birth is the coming to being of an animate thing. So he literally is showing like, hey, there's a confusion in Plutarch's day on what's the word mean here? What is going on here? And it can mean both. Paul uses that particular term, and that's where mythicists are right in pointing out this is actually a come into being concept. But the Christology, if you know pre-existent Jesus, comes into being. They think he exists, and he comes into being through a woman born of the seed of David. Sounds like pretty mundane terms that he is of royal lineage genealogically, and this sounds like a human. Now, I know that Dr. Carrier does say he's a human, or at least some type of mortal who's made of a woman, but he's made in outer space. He's only in heaven, and I don't find that plausible in my view. So that was all I had to read there. But wait till you actually, there's a lot of notes here and a lot of stuff that goes to the Greek verbiage.
Go to slide 13 there. Yeah, perfect. So he's talking about Romans 1:3, something I have a big problem with. As you know, Derek, I'm learning Greek. I don't know much Greek yet, so I can't really read the Greek letters yet. I know some words, like trapeza, if I'm pronouncing that right, means bank. And the thing is, okay, so Romans 1 is what Dr. Carrier claims is talking about Jesus being born of a heavenly, cosmic seed of David.
Mm-hmm.
So if that were true, the kind of thing that I would expect to see there, why isn't there a strange phrase like cosmic sperm bank, which would say something, which would basically in Greek, from what I understand, would be something like cosmos, because cosmos is cosmos, obviously, and then so cosmos sperma trapeza.
Mm-hmm.
So cosmos sperma trapeza. Why don't we find that phrase there? When I tried looking into that from other translations, what experts had to say about it, I'm like, okay, so that phrase doesn't really, from what I know, that phrase doesn't exist in any Christian literature. And I'm being careful of my words here, like from what I know. So I missed something, somebody can correct me. But I'm like, do we have a phrase like that anywhere? No.
Well,
now Paul does. It's not, yes, I know Paul uses the word sperma in some places in his letters, but never in that context.
To me, I mean, and I know this is going to sound funny, but come literally, as Stephen pointed out to me, like come literally is the same as to come into being. It's got
Yeah.
a similar concept of, hey, what we would call an orgasm. And I know that it's kind of funny, but in reality, that seems to be the case. I did want to mention in the commentary on Romans, Douglas J. Moo, he has a plausible explanation here for the Pauline thing. The first participle clause, verse 3b, focuses, and this is in Romans 1:3, focuses on the Son of God coming into human existence. This clause assumes the pre-existence of the Son. So we talked about the Christology. How specifically Paul may allude to the incarnation depends on the meaning to be, given the word genomenon has come. Although it is not the usual word for give birth, it can sometimes take this meaning, and some argue for it here. But this probably reads too much into the verb. Perhaps Paul uses the more general term to suggest that more than a simple birth, his birth is obviously more than just any average Joe, right? He is the Son of God. You don't want like, hey, so Sally just had a baby, she birthed him. Like, this is the Son of God in Paul's mind. This is somebody important and of divine status. So it's a bigger emphasis than just birth. Naturally, you want to emphasize something bigger with the incarnation. So he says, more than a simple birth was entailed in the becoming of the Son of God. A change in existence also took place. This appearance of the Son on the human scene is qualified as being from the seed of David, a clear allusion to the messianic stature of the Son. So then he goes on and on. But I don't know when or where all of these slides will become accessible, but he goes into examples. If you go back to, we'll go back to that slide for 1 second just to point out. Carrier says, of course, examples of later Christian authors quoting or riffing on Romans don't count here. And so I don't, I get maybe being cautious, but I've dealt with this kind of issue at one point. If you want to stop sharing the screen or pop us back up, we could talk about this for a second. Might be worth doing that for our audience to kind of watch us discuss this.
Sure.
So you remember the Israel only guys that we've dealt with?
I do.
And I don't want to create a fallacy here, but the Israel only guys, they would actually say stuff like, if it isn't in the New Testament or written in Jewish literature before this time, then it is irrelevant to the discussion and it bears no value to the dialogue. In these slides, Stephen goes through and finds Eusebius, and those terms for come into being and birthed are used interchangeably. And it's really something that I need to wrap my head around more into, investigating this. But what really gave it away to me was just born of a woman of the seed of David. He's crucified. These were the mundane things that I'm like, you got a guy named Paul writing between Philo and Josephus. It just makes more sense to me that there was a guy. I mean, I don't know why it wouldn't be. And all of the same apotheosis tales that we have of people coming to earth, boom, they have an ascension narrative where they end up becoming a god and their bodies go missing or whatever it may be. They go from grave to heaven, or even some are taken while they're still alive, depending on the translation fable, that Jesus fits that same trope. He came to earth. I don't know why we stopped in heaven. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Right. Why didn't it happen entirely in heaven, and why didn't it just stay confined in heaven? Because let's go back to the Romulus thing for a moment. Did he stay in heaven the entire time? No. According to the myth, he came down. There was a time when he was on earth. According to this idea, Jesus was crucified in heaven, as if his entire ministry happened in heaven, kind of like what the Docetics believe, the Docetists. Entirely happened in heaven. And had it put it that way, then I think I probably would agree, okay, fine, he didn't exist, because the whole thing happened in heaven. Not one moment was it on earth. But that's not quite how the story goes.
I'm with you. I think that the thrust, you kind of have to assume between Paul's letters and the Gospels that there's some, conspiracy to completely invent a historical guy. I see the legend even in Paul. So when we talk about, well, Gospels are fiction, Paul's letters, those are like real historical documents. I'm not in denial of that. I think they are historical documents, but he's already characterizing the trope. He has eyewitness testimonies. He has a son of God. He has someone who's obviously divine. They end up overcoming death. I mean, like, he, in a weird mystical sense, they're all united through the pneuma, which is the Stoic Middle Platonic position, that they are all united by this physical, by the way. Christians today have lost this. They've lost the philosophy of Paul. Like, it's a physical essence or a substance that's physical. The reason that the trees bend when the wind blows is, as they would think in their science, was it's physical. The pneuma actually is a physical thing that pushes the trees over. And that wind, that breath, that pneuma is what unites the early Christians. And so they have a strange Christology already with a legendary trope that I think they're already pushing. I think the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and I know the various thoughts. I know that, is this late? Is this an interpolation? Robert M. Price would say, because why didn't the Gospels, if Paul came first, mention the 500 brethren? Wouldn't that be something to really nail down? Maybe. I can't read their minds. I hear so many different people. Dr. Allison, who will say in his resurrection book, well, they didn't want to mention the women because Paul was very, as he would say, male-centric, right? And he would say that the early church was all about men. Some letters seem to be favorable to women in Paul, and then some say, shh, don't talk, you let your husband teach you, yada, yada, yada. But then you look at the Gospels, and you have women playing a significant role in these narratives. The woman at the well in John, of course, who goes and tells the testimony of a man who told her everything about her, and they all believed her testimony. So it's kind of weird. You don't know what's true and what isn't for sure. And I'm very open-minded on this, and I think people should be more open-minded, not too dogmatic. But if Paul's already carrying a legendary trope, you have to assume that the legend went so far beyond what Paul's legend already was to make him from outer space to earth. I don't see the thrust. It's kind of like the James, the brother of the Lord thing. It doesn't say James, the brother of Jesus, says the Lord. That means he could be a baptized Christian. I get the argument. I get it. And you can comment. I don't mind, but I'm just making one point. I'm looking at the Gospel of Mark, right? Our earliest written letters that kind of go along this story building off of Paul. Mark, I think, knows Paul. And in Mark, he has a brother in the story. He has an actual biological brother named James, and other brothers as well. But he has an actual brother named James. So we have to assume between Mark and Paul's letters that they invented a historical brother for Jesus. And yet in Paul, this is just a baptized Christian and not an actual brother. And for me, I understand both possibilities. But one of the earliest voices tries to say he had a brother. Maybe he had a brother named James. What's the big deal? I don't get the problem for me.
Yeah, the way that Paul uses those words is he's trying to single out James as being the actual brother of Jesus. And when he uses brother to refer to other people, it's in the plural and never in the same way as he referred to James as being the brother of the Lord. And that's my problem. Can't really be the brother of someone that doesn't exist. So I think that's a real bad start there. I don't think that's a good argument at all.
Well, I mean, if you take the position, and there is good evidence to support the idea that baptized Christians are brothers in the Lord, you can run with that. But I'm just making the point. You have a voice already in Mark that seems to be implying a tradition that they may be completely inventing. But when I'm reading Mark and I see that Jesus gets baptized by John, right? I'm not going into whether or not John the Baptist historically and Jesus really interacted or not. I don't know. I think that's the best position to take, is I don't know. But I do see Paul's baptism ideas coming through in Mark's baptism of Jesus. Because in the baptism of Jesus in Mark, the pneuma, the Holy Spirit of God comes down, it rests on Jesus, and of course, only Jesus gets whispered, you are my son, and you. Matthew goes, this is my son, but Mark, it's talking to Jesus. Nobody gets it. Even John the Baptist is like, are you the blessed one? He's not sure. Mary doesn't seem to know about a virgin birth or anything like that. If she's wondering why my son's gone crazy and she doesn't get what he's doing, like, didn't you birth this guy? Didn't Gabriel tell you he was born? That's later stuff. So I'm reading that and I see that baptism of Jesus to kind of be, in a sense, what Richard Carrier has said about an etymological type myth, that this is how Christians should also be baptized. But if you take that, where did that come from? Paul. So you have to imagine that the tale of Mark is going so out of its way to fictionalize things that, like, this isn't on earth in Paul. Where does he get these ideas from? And in what way did he actually think that the baptism of Jesus reflects Paul? This is something I would say lends credibility towards, here's Paul. We don't really know how to get behind him. That's the problem of the historical Jesus, is getting behind Paul. Because when I read the Gospels, I'm seeing Paul. I see a lot of Paul pop up. And I'm going, is that Jesus or is that Paul? And many of the scholars will tell you, like Robin Faith Walsh and others, that's the hard part. That's the part where we just don't know. But the model structure, historical position, to me makes the most sense. Just give me contemporaneous or even somewhat contemporaneous text that emphasizes this whole heavenly stuff. Like, give me more of that, and I would be going back into mythicism.
So you have a video that you want to share? I think the connection, by the way, is really good now. It might actually work if we try it through streaming.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
let's test that.
This here. All right. Forgive me if my quality today sucked. I don't know why, but
it's been pretty good for a while now. So
I hope so. Okay, do you have it up?
I do.
Let's see if this works this time, and if it does glitch, it glitches. This has never been shared before. You all on History Valley are the first time viewing this. I might as well tell you before I hit play, just in case it glitches me out. This is when I was in North Carolina before I moved where I'm at now. I went to visit Charlotte to talk with Dr. James Tabor and record courses on the Gospel of Mark. I highly recommend you sign up. I think Jacob Berman has a link. I don't know if that's in the description or not.
It is in the description, yes.
Excellent. Go sign up for his course on Mark. It's really wonderful. This is a nail, an actual unused crucifixion nail from the 1st century. And this nail right here is just an example. Here. Can you hear it when it does play?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here's the nail.
It's going to be glitchy, so bear with me.
Yeah.
Dr. Tabor. You want to tell us about that?
Man, I wish it wasn't. That's what I was trying to upload to YouTube, and it might have messed up my whole
this was
internet.
found in Jerusalem, outside the western city wall, not the western wall, where Jews today pray.
So he's actually given the commentary where they found this, how they discovered it. Let me try and fast forward it a little bit.
Awesome.
By Mack and Broshi.
And of course, the Jerusalem's Antiquities department sent that to him. Of course, it's loaned to him. He'll have to send that back. But it just seems to me like, man, you could say, I'm going to stop sharing now. You could say that, like, they created a fantastic idea that Jesus was crucified in outer space. I don't start when people talk about basketball. People aren't thinking Space Jam. They're most likely thinking of actual sports that are actually happening here on Earth where people are doing it. Now I keep using the word actually because Dr. Carrier will emphasize that he actually believes that Paul believes, not that he really believes himself, but that Paul and the earliest Christians believe this is a real guy in outer space that really was born of a woman from the actual seed of David, et cetera, et cetera. I'm more like, I think Jews were carrying genealogies. This is why I think there's accusations of, like, who cares about genealogies? And, there's even like critiques of people who are talking about genealogies going on in the early church. And
yes,
Jews were saying, like, I got pedigree, and even with Herod and who was the high priest of the year that ended up getting killed? I can't remember if Herod killed him or not, but this guy had supposed real descent through some holy or royal line. It makes more sense on Earth. Until you show me Space Jam, I just don't buy the Space Jam thing anymore. And that made the most sense to me at first, but it started to not make as much sense after investigating and learning from other scholars. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's to me, I want to go back to the baptism thing real quick. I think to me it makes sense John the Baptist baptized Jesus. I don't have a problem with that. And now that we're on that topic, I think that James, the brother of Jesus mentioned by Josephus, I don't think that was added. I know that some people that happen to be historicists want to make a case that isn't there, which I think is odd. I mean, it's in. I know we don't have many manuscripts of Josephus, but
that one seems more likely to me than the other one. You know what I mean?
In the couple of manuscripts of Josephus we've got, it's in there, and Origen of Alexandria seems to know about it. Yeah, he might have partially misquoted it, but for the most part, he was faithful to what Josephus said. So I don't really understand why some people want to believe it wasn't there. Or maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. I don't understand why some people think it's not there. That's what I meant to say.
I mean, I've heard arguments, right? I'm not well versed on this particular issue. I've heard arguments from all sides. For me, that James passage seems far more likely than the other passage. But even then, is it a partial interpolation? Or I don't know. Do you still buy? I don't want to get caught up in this because this is kind of irrelevant to our thing. But because Josephus mentions crucifixion, I think it's important to point out it makes sense, right? The title of this video, why the crucifixion of Jesus makes sense.
Yes.
You got Jews before and after. It's pretty common sense for me. You got Jews before Philo. You got Jews after Josephus. You've got Jews in between Paul. They all mention crucifixion. They're all mentioning people are being born of royal lines, such as in Josephus. In fact, let me share my screen again. This is worth kind of pointing out. And where do I go here? Let's do this. Share this. So back to the slide. I'm looking for where's the Josephus one? Bear with me here. Origen. So Origen, of course, uses over and over to be born. That even in Origen, all of them, Eusebius, you name, they've got an incarnation kind of Christology in which they're using these terms. Josephus, here we are. So this is not the one. Born to David of the wife of Uriah. I'm trying to think where it is. Oh, this is one of the things that Carrier picks on a particular understanding or translation of Josephus where he says made. Here is Winston, but if you look over here in the Thackeray, it's preserve, I think it is. Let me see. In the belief that they too would suffer nothing, little dream. Let me see. Reserved. Here it is. So it's reserved rather than made. So it could mean that. Trying to find the particular one where Josephus is mentioning they're from divine lineage. Anyway, I don't even know where I'm looking at this point because we were going over this stuff earlier. And it is, again, a born, but of divine birth. And I know the meaning can be both, but I think if we're historicists, what we do need to do is recognize there is an emphasis on why Paul would want to use to be made. And if we can recognize Paul's using to be made as significant, then it might actually make sense of our pre-existent and coming into being idea of the Christology, that they thought Jesus might have pre-existed and actually came through a mortal woman. And this is the interesting thing I'd like to really nail down. I think is implied by my reading of Dr. Carey and all the interviews I've done. In Paul's mind, Jesus is really seriously literal flesh and blood, but in the third heaven. Like he actually has actual physical blood. He has everything technically that we have and that are here on Earth, but up there. And to me, it's like all you need is one step to just say he came to Earth. He was here on Earth, and they thought he was born. And it's I just don't have that step that says he only remained up here or he, went to outer space. We know Jesus in the flesh no more, Paul says in Galatians. So, did you know him in outer space in the flesh? To me, it's more plausible here. And it's little mundane things like that makes it more likely. We're dealing with a guy, and he got extremely mythologized, legend built up around him. And that's just my take.
That makes sense. I have no super chats so far except one.
Super chat those questions, even critical ones. I don't mind. I mean, I want to help you out, Jacob. You work very hard with this channel. You've been working very hard for a while now, and you're pulling in top-notch, brilliant scholars. You're doing a fantastic job doing that, and you're getting better and better at your craft. So I really commend you, and I hope that people who follow you, who enjoy your stuff and love listening to you, will help support you to keep you doing this, because over the next few years, I can't imagine how many more topics you're going to cover and what kind of influence that you're impacting even in the scholarly world. I know that's happening. We've been discussing some of that. So anybody watching, if you have any questions for me, Jacob, anything, even just showing support for Jacob means a lot.
Thank you very much. That means a lot. And I also want to say the same thing about you, Derek. You've been doing wonderful work with your channel. A lot of work. It's really awesome. You've done a lot of great interviews yourself, and it was very enjoyable to watch you from the start grow to where you are now.
Thanks, brother. Yeah. Hey, we've been a team. We might have had hiccups in the past, but look, my best friend is my brother, and we don't talk all the time. We've had our bumps in the past, but he's my brother. And so I think that, we're showing growth, and I think we should continue to encourage good thinking. As a host, you allow many voices in your chat. You allow other people with different voices to participate. And I think that if you're going to be fair, that's the best thing, because not everybody is seeing things the same way. And sometimes we're in different paths, right? So we might be at a certain point in our journey. One person might be like, no, mythicism makes the most sense to me. Okay.
Yeah.
Like, cool. I don't, I'm not going to discourage it. If you want to ask me personally why I'm not mythicist anymore, I'll give you my reasonings, and you may not be satisfied with those. And that is totally fine. Right. It doesn't hurt my feelings. Look, I don't believe you're going to hell for thinking that Jesus didn't exist or did. But if I'm going to be fair to what I think, looking at the material, a guy who is mythologized, great. I think that makes the most sense. But what do you do? What do you do, man? There's so many different people out there that have different voices, that are scholars, that are worth looking at.
Absolutely. But yeah, our hour is almost up, so let's get to the super chats.
Hey, I'm here for you. Yeah. Don't worry about rushing. I'm here to hang out. So if we can get some super chats and get the party started, let's do it. Yeah. Let's help Jacob out here. Seriously, Jacob, you haven't had me on in I don't know if a long time. It's been a minute since Ralph Ellis. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the last time we got together was about Ellis. How many men are Jesus tomorrow? Never ends. I mean, he's actually he's recently starting to say that Amessa and Edessa are the same place now because their names sound like,
Vanessa is also the same. No, I mean, and add Vanessa to the list. You might as well add Vanessa and then Tesla. Man. Tesla.
Oh, there you go.
They named the car factory after this land. It's really the same place. It's the same place.
Tesla invented tennis.
Goodness.
He actually claims to have been an airlines pilot, Ellis. I'm like, well, if that were true, I'm not stepping on that plane that you're flying, because you're going to tell him, he's going to say, we're going to go to Washington, D.C. Actually, that's Washington State. Tennessee is Tennessee, Egypt, and Memphis, the United States is Memphis. Never ends.
It doesn't. It never ends, brother. Never ends. I think it's funny.
It really is. It's sad that he believes this stuff. Max the Confessor, thank you for the super chat, but I don't know where you're going.
Max in the hizzy?
Max the Confessor.
What's up, Max?
Quick question, Jacob. Did you actually get a PhD from Price? Laughing out loud. Well, it's not a PhD. It was a honorary PhD from the Journal of Higher Criticism, and it's not an actual PhD, as he himself has admitted to me. It's a nice souvenir, but that's all it is.
Is it fair to say that Dr. Bob is saying, look, James, you've been impressive. You've learned quite a bit. And it's the best I can do is just say, this is something that I think you've really earned. Like, you're super smart. He's not like working within any academic structure trying to do this. So it's the highest accolade you can get from the encyclopedia we call Dr. Robert M. Price. So I don't think yeah. Now, if you were taking that seriously and literal, of course, then that would be like, this is
no, it's not it's a nice souvenir, but that's all it is.
Right. Thank you, Max.
Motorhead, thank you for your super chat. No question there. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Heck yeah.
Michael Apple, thank you for your super chat. Please discuss the relationship between resurrection, disappearance, and R.C. Miller. Never gets old. I'm going to leave that to you, Derek, because I have not read him.
Okay. I am in love with this book, and you won't believe what happened. So I'm flying back from Florida I did 2 course recordings, lecture recordings with Robin Faith Walsh. Mind-blowing material, Paul and the Gospels, 2 separate courses. And I was already into chapter 2 while reading at the hotel while I was out there doing the recordings. And on my way back, chapter 2 is where you're talking about the actual disappearances. On my way back, I read the rest of the book on the flights, and I fell asleep on the last flight. And then I got off the flight, and I realized when I got home, oh my gosh, I forgot Richard C. Miller's book on the aircraft. So I so then I ended up writing a review, of course, for the book on Amazon. I hope it's up by now. And then contacted him and said, hey, can we get the publisher? I know I'm a knucklehead. Can you get the publisher to send me another book? It's that good of a book. That's my little plug for it. The book takes you first into the earliest apologist for Christianity. Justin Martyr, Church Fathers, Origen, you name it. And they're all equivocating Christianity, the Jesus mythos, topos, with that of the sons of Zeus, etc. So he wants to first tell you, like, hey, they recognize that this is no different than what you guys are doing over here in the Greek and Roman world with your Caesars, with your demigods, with your gods, with your heroes, you name it. Asclepius, Dionysus, on and on. In chapter 2, I'm going to share my screen here to tease people, if you don't mind, Jacob. There you go. Chapter 2, right? So here in 2.3, which is the translation fables, he goes into a gallery of names and, of course, the different people in alphabetical order from Laurentia. And I mean, literally all of these, every single one of these, I'll give you an example. He gives you the source. Let me get one that everybody knows. Let me get one that everybody's heard of. Asclepius, right? So here's Asclepius. The sources, where you're going to find it. Hesiod, Hyginus, Astrology 214, Fab, Lucian, Dial, Minucius, Felix, Octavius, Galen, commentary on the covenants of Hippocrates, and of course, Origen against Celsus. Fable. Here's the fable. Asclepius was killed by Zeus's lightning and granted translation. After Asclepius' death, Zeus placed Asclepius' body among the stars as the constellation. I always mess this up. I'm just going to call it Serpent Holder. Galen, circa 180 CE, instanced another tradition indicating that, as happened with Hercules and Dionysus, Asclepius ascended to the gods in a column of fire. According to Celsus, Asclepius often appeared in a physical. Jesus was born or resurrected, as everyone wants to argue. He's in a physical body in some way, right? So he appeared in a physical post-mortem form to perform many miracles of healing. Origen tacitly concurred that such accounts abundantly circulated. Hyginus, however you pronounce it, reveals that the translated Asclepius became the constellation Ophiuchus. I hope I pronounced that properly. The sub-theme. So you're going to find in the sub-theme of every one of these, that particular translation fables kind of details, right? The translation is associated with Zeus's thunderbolt. Ascension is associated with Asclepius. Post-mortem translation, post-translation appearance, and catasterism. So at the beginning of this, before he goes into these tons and tons of examples that you see here that are so worth reading. I mean, there's just so many of them. I had to drink coffee going through this section because it's hard to get through them. It's really good as a source to go and reference, to point out. I mean, look, we're not stopping. They're all sub-themes that are similar, and they're not identical. Sometimes the person goes into a river and or a body of water and disappears. Sometimes it's Zeus's thunderbolt. Sometimes it's a pyre of fire, right? So a fire that ends up consuming them. Sometimes they're walking on a road. Sometimes they're dead and then they're taken. Sometimes they don't even die. None of them are Xerox copies of each other. So when the Christian apologists or those who are against this notion love going, no, there's no copying. You don't even need to say, just grant them. Sure, nobody's plagiarizing. Fine. Let's stop arguing that point. You don't need to plagiarize to know that the topos, as we keep saying, the tradition, the stories that are out there, this is how you write them. It's obvious. And it goes on and on and on. So this chapter is a thick one that goes into the various translations. But what is common, what is almost in every case guaranteed to be there, and we can come back to, I'm just showing that chapter too. I didn't even show the whole chapter. It's dense. Every sentence is very dense. So it's not an easy read. I had to get my Google out and look up definitions along the way because it was very heavy scholarly stuff. What you find without a doubt, ubiquitous across these fables, is their body goes missing. The body goes missing. In every situation, in some way, shape, or form, they disappear. Jesus's body is missing from the tomb. It's so obvious. And even if you wanted to argue, let's just say Paul doesn't explicitly say anything like this. He says he was buried and then resurrected. There's no missing body trope or theme in 1 Corinthians 15. But his body is emphasized that he no longer will have flesh and blood. But he has a pneuma body, a spiritual body, right? So even then, it's like the flesh and blood body has to be gone somehow or irrelevant to the point. So is this in line with the rest of the tropes? Mark makes sure that it is. If you don't think Paul did, Mark capitalizes on this. It's legendary. So that I love Richard C. Miller. I love this super chat. I really appreciate people pointing this out. And guess who pointed it out to me? Derek Bennett. Derek, come here real quick. Just come say hey to everybody. You won't be able to hear anybody. Just come wave. It was this guy right here, Derek Bennett. Say hey to Jacob.
Hey to everybody. Hey.
He introduced me to Richard C. Miller in terms of his work. And then once I found Richard, I was like, get out of my way. No, I really thank Derek for introducing me to this guy. I didn't even know his book existed. Then when I found it, it was over, Jacob. I was like, oh, he has the sources and everything. You can't play. My favorite, since we're on the page, you get me excited. Mm-hmm. You know me. All right, one more time, I'm sharing the screen just for a second. You don't have to keep me up too long with this. This is just one point, and this has been shared before. For those who haven't seen it, here it is. This right here. This is the translation of Romulus and Jesus compared. Both have a missing body. Both have prodigies. Both have darkness over the land. Mountaintop speech and Great Commission, where Romulus tells Proculus Julius, hey, go tell them that my city, Rome, will rule the world. Guess what happened? They ruled the frickin' world. We should worship Romulus now. Come on. Ascension narratives in both. Son of a god. Meeting on a road. Eyewitness testimony. Both were taken away in a cloud. Dubious alternative accounts, meaning there's an account where Romulus gets killed by the Senate, and there's another account he doesn't get killed, he gets taken to heaven. Well, as M. David Litwell points out, or M. David Litwell, Richard C. Miller, points out in this book, this idea of him being killed is actually modeled after Julius Caesar's death by the Senate. So it's actually a Johnny-come-lately narrative for Romulus. It only comes up on the scene after Julius Caesar actually gets killed by the Senate. Anyway, immortal heavenly body. Outside the city, people flee, deification, belief, homage, and rejoicing, bright and shining appearance, and then frightened, all in sorrow over loss, inspired message of apotheosis. There you go. Sorry.
Oh no, that's great. Just don't give Ellis any ideas. He's just going to say Richard Miller and Robert Price are the same guy. Richard Carrier too.
I already knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, and you know the joke I told you on the phone the other day that you and Derek Bennett are the same guy too.
Yeah. You just saw my identical me. Actually,
you're bilocating. Yeah,
we're actually docetic. So docetism is true, and he is me. I don't feel any pain. He's the version that seems like it does, but it doesn't feel pain. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Max the Confessor again. Thank you for another super chat. New theory for Ralph Ellis. Nazareth as Nezar is Nazi. Jesus was Hyperborean.
Oh my gosh.
Oh wow. That's a brain cell killer right there.
Wow, Max. Thanks for the super chat, Max. Appreciate you in the chat.
You know, don't give Ellis any ideas. He's going to say Vespasian came from China because Asians in there.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Contextual religion. Thank you for the super chat. History Valley used to listen to your show a lot more when I was into Roman provenance stuff. Moved away from all of that, but it's good to see you again. Is the Roman stuff still your focus? It is, but I also do a lot of other videos that are not about that. So,
yeah.
I mean, I just want to say real quick, Roman provenance, even if it's true, it does not disprove a historical Jesus. In fact, in my view, it makes better sense of a historical Jesus, because creating propaganda about a guy that didn't exist doesn't make any sense to me. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, while I don't think the Caesars concocted what we're seeing in the New Testament, I did talk to Robin Walsh, and just to tease you all, she teases also in the course as well. She's writing another book that's coming out on Paul, and I think an article, I can't remember, article, books, stuff. She says that these authors of the Gospels are sophisticated, most likely elites. And I say that meaning they had money, but that doesn't mean that they had to. They could just be highly educated and not be rich. But they're not the high end. They're wannabes. This is her words. They're wannabe Plutarchs. They're wannabe Tacituses. They're wannabe Josephus. They're not on that level. They're above average for sure, but they're not all the way up here where you would imagine if Vespasian or Titus or any of these Domitian were like actually involved in trying to create this stuff. She says they would have written way better than this, and it didn't come out that way. So it still grants that this is sophisticated, educated literature and not just some fisherman who just jumped off the Sea of Galilee, found some tax collector and said, "Hey, write this down, get out of town." That's ridiculous. So
Max the Confessor again. Thanks for another super chat. Read Bardasian's Laws of the Nations, 2nd to 3rd century apologetics was basically Indians, Babylonians, Romans, and Persians believe what we believe.
I haven't read that. I've not even heard of them.
I don't think I have either.
Bardasian's Laws of the Nations. Interesting. Thank you, Max. That's something worth checking out.
Yep. Well, that's it for the moment. No more super chats. But yeah, do you have is your interviews going to start soon? Your next
Actually,
one?
I rescheduled it. His internet at the hotel sucks, and so he was like, I can't. If I do it, it's going to come in and out. So I just chose to reschedule and make that better. But yeah, if anybody else wants to super chat any questions, feel free. If you have any questions for me, feel free. Let me know.
Yeah, I think what turns off a lot of people about Roman provenance is the more extreme version of it, the mythicist version of Roman provenance, that this idea that the Romans had fabricated the Jesus character to um, pacify Jewish rebellion. That doesn't make sense to me. In fact, the way I look at it is, I think, in a sense, the New Testament starts out pro-Roman and then it ends anti-Roman with John Revelation. That's the way I look at it.
Right.
And I actually don't believe that the Caesars had a direct hand in the composition of the New Testament. I think I think Eisenman's right that Paul was a Herodian. And there's another scholar I've had on my show, Dr. James Audlin, also thinks that's correct. But I think that's very different from suggesting that the New Testament was literally commissioned by the Romans. I don't believe that. As a matter of fact, I think when Paul was writing his letters, I think his position has changed. I actually think I think retrospectively he talks about his past. Like take Galatians, for example. When he wrote Galatians, regardless if you think this was written before or after the war, he's not writing this when he argued with James, met James, the brother of Jesus, not
Right.
immediately. He tells us that, well, if this happened 3 years ago, that 14 years ago, is all happening so long ago to him. And I think he's speaking retrospectively in Galatians 1 and 2. But if you shift to Galatians 3 to 6, there's a new argument there that he's dealing with presently, and he's agitated about it. And to him, he's trying to remind his audience that I'm going through another theological argument again, just like I did back then, as I mentioned in chapters 1 and 2. Here we go again. Now we have another argument in Galatians chapter 3, and he refers to them as fools for rejecting the crucifixion of Jesus. He tells them that Jesus was portrayed as being crucified among you. That's what he says in the beginning of Galatians chapter 3. And I think that's a present argument, something that's happening right at the moment. But yeah, I think when Paul was writing his letters, he was more concerned with theological division in the Christian church. Hence, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, there's multiple leaders he's competing with, like Apollos, Cephas, or John the Pillar. And he goes as far as saying that some people believe in Christ without believing in him. And he's agitated about that. But I think he also makes allusions to being concerned that some persecution has befallen the church at the hands of the Gentiles. So I think, because my view of it's very different from, it already sounds very different when you think about it compared to other Roman provenance, because many in the Roman provenance position think Paul didn't exist and his letters are fake, somebody else wrote them and all that stuff. Some of them even think Gospels were written before Paul, which is, to me, that doesn't make any sense. Had Paul had access to the Gospels, he would have had more information to use. He could have quoted a mythologized Jesus to back up his position in Galatians, for example, when he confronts Peter to the face, but he doesn't. And so he has a harder time arguing.
Yeah, I can't imagine these letters of Paul having the Gospels or even one of the Gospels. I can't imagine that making any sense. And then he writes what he does rather than what we see in the Gospels. I could see something mundane like Paul and his letters being utilized into the narratives of the Gospels, but I just don't see how, if you have all those narratives, you're not going to use that material more than he does. And it's just, there's a huge absence of material that you would expect probably Paul to use if he's aware of these stories about Jesus like that. And I don't think he's either aware of them or it's irrelevant to his agenda at the point where he's dealing with a crucified Jesus at this point, a resurrected Jesus. So he's interacting with a resurrected Christ in his position.
Yeah, I think that's another video that we could do in the future about what I actually believe about Roman provenance, because it's very, very different from what from what other people know about Roman provenance. And people have asked me to talk about my views because I'm like, I'm interviewing people all the time, but I haven't discussed my own views
very
much. I found a while.
to correctly get this right, because I don't know if
Yeah.
the definitions have changed since we last did this, and then I
Yeah.
don't know if you have a super chat you got to get to, but I figure I'd ask real quick before we do jump to the super chat is, from what I understand about the Roman provenance position, is that it is a top-down definition that Rome is actively involved in the creation or even in the funding or somehow in the New Testament literature and Christianity at this point. Now there are variations. You've got Atwell, you've got James Valiant, you've got other people. But like, can you call yourself a Roman provenance person if you don't believe that the Caesars were involved in any of the creation or the early Christian movement?
So this is going to take a while for me to explain, but to briefly summarize, because I don't want to go far off the topic about Jesus, the historicity of Jesus here. I think the New Testament had access to maybe a couple of sources that were probably Roman propaganda, but I don't think the New Testament itself was directly commissioned by the government, the Roman government. I think it's more of an indirect situation. And I think Paul started out as pro-Roman, hunting down Christians, and I think what happened closer to the end of his life is he actually became anti-Roman because a particular Roman emperor came into power, and it's like, no, I don't want to back this nonsense up. I'm going to return to the old ways. As a matter of fact, a Roman historian, I think it's Suetonius, if I remember correctly, says that when Emperor Domitian came to power, he said, we're returning to the old ways now. He actually says that. We're going back to traditional ways. However you want to interpret that, I think he was concerned that the Roman traditional religious system was threatened. And so he undermined the plans of the prior two Flavian emperors, Vespasian and his son Titus. They're actually both called Titus Vespasian. So
Right.
Titus Vespasian Sr. and Jr. And once they were out of the way, Domitian could do whatever the hell he wanted. And I think Paul was living in that time, in my view. And let me rephrase that. I think Paul died later in the first century, even other people believe, but that's my point of view. And I think by the time he started writing his letters, he became estranged with Rome, if you get my meaning. I don't think they were friendly towards each other anymore. And I think it really starts with Domitian that the persecution of Christians really began. I know some people say it's Nero, but some people question that reference in Tacitus. Is he really talking about Christians, or are those actually Jews? To me, I think that I do think Nero persecuted proto-Christians, an earlier version of the Christian movement that probably didn't even have the name Christian yet. I tend to suspect Tacitus might have been referring to them as Christians anachronistically, because the term Christian or Christianos was more popular in his time. But they were essentially the same people, regardless if they were called Christians in Nero's time or not. I hope that explains it pretty well.
There's a lot there we'd have to follow up and do something.
Yeah, I would have to show slides and whatever and visualize what I'm talking about. Lysander, thank you for the super chat. No question there. But
oh no, they got a question.
Where?
A couple. Was Paul a liar, or did he really have a vision hallucination? My favorite channel's doing a stream.
Yeah, there was an earlier super chat where he had no question. That's what I was bringing up.
Oh, well, no, they did, but the question was below. Look at the comment down below. Yeah, so they just wanted to make sure that you got it because they probably thought you were going to miss it.
Okay. I appreciate the two super chats anyway, Lysander. Really do.
Did Paul really have a vision, or was he a liar?
That's a good question. If you don't mind me going first.
Sure.
Since I take a later chronological position on Paul's vision, I'm going to say this tentatively because I haven't fully made up my mind on this. Okay, so if subject to change, but I think that Paul's vision could have happened maybe sometime in the 60s or perhaps around 70 when the temple was destroyed. But we don't really, I don't know. Acts gives us a more detailed version of his vision than Paul gives us. A lot of scholars think that Acts is unreliable. There are those that think that the we document of Acts, which is essentially Acts 16 up to 28, came from an earlier document that was stitched together by, I guess, the person we want to call Luke. And I think I agree with that position, because it's kind of strange to me how it just suddenly flips from third person to first person. And several scholars believe that this is because the we document goes back to probably a real child companion of Paul, but we don't know who that person was. And the person that put Acts, assembled Acts together,
Bear with me.
yeah, spliced the two together into the same text, if that makes any sense.
So I'm with Dennis on this, but it's not just Dennis. Robin Faith Walsh, Dennis, you name it. Richard C. Miller, we talked about earlier, specifically the Aeneid, right, which is the latest one. The Odyssey and the Iliad, of course. The Aeneid is actually rewriting the Roman history, making Julius Caesar, and the Augustan line, the true sons of God, and that their kingdom is going to last forever. I see the book of Acts as a rival narrative about a son of God named Jesus, who is going to be an eternal peace-giving son of God king, and his kingdom will rule forever. And if you go in the Aeneid, and I'm not sure which, hey, Derek, do you remember the we passages in the Aeneid? I know they're in the Odyssey too, and they're in the Aeneid, but I don't know if you remember what chapter they were at. So we'll go to the Odyssey, but I know that the Aeneid also riffs off of that. You said chapter 10?
Yeah.
I figure it's worth reading book 10, just for the sake of our audience here, because they're paying good money here. We got to give them something, right? So book 10, and now anyone who's read the Odyssey and knows about Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey knows that this is a highly fictional work. That doesn't mean there aren't real places, that there aren't real themes. I mean, you have to have a fiction like this grafted into the verisimilitude of the place and time in which you're trying to write. And here's how chapter 10 opens up. It's called The Bewitching of Queen, what is this, Ea. Listen to how this is written. We reached the Aeolian island next, the home of Aeolus, Hippotas, son beloved by the gods who never die. A great flooding island it was, and around it all huge ramparts rise of indestructible bronze, and sheer rock cliffs shoot up from the sea to the sky. The king had stirred 12 children within his halls, 6 daughters and 6 sons in the lusty prime of youth. So he gave his daughters as wives to his sons, seated beside their dear father and doting mother, with delicacies aplenty spread before them. They feast on forever, all day long. The halls breathe the savor of roasted meats and echo round to the low moan of blowing pipes. Anyway, it goes on, and it literally says, like, we did this and we did that, and we were so close. We could see men tending fires, but now an enticing sleep came on me. Literally first person there, not just third person. Bone weary from working in the vessel sheet myself, no let up, never trusting the ropes to any other mate. The point is this is fiction, and it has we passages that seem to be trying to say, like, they actually did this and they actually did that. When I read Acts of the Apostles and I hear the we passages, which, by the way, in the we passages, you also have a shipwreck. And where else do we get this shipwreck with we passages? We get it in Homer's Odyssey, and we get it in the Aeneid, and we get it in the book of Acts. And in the shipwreck, get this, F.F. Bruce, Dennis McDonald, in our recordings here said, even conservative Christian scholar F.F. Bruce said that the book of Acts is using the Odyssey for his shipwreck narrative with Paul. And I thought that's pretty telling when even a Christian who's very conservative scholar is like, yeah, Yep. Dennis is onto something, at least here. They'll deny it everywhere else. At least, they don't really like to see it like Dennis does and others, but they clearly see this as Greek Roman novel type material. And that's why I don't buy the historical approach. Is there history there? Maybe. I mean, if you read any of these 3 books, you're going to get a lot of geographical places, even people who may or may not have existed. It goes on and on. And in fact, one more thing, the Aeneid, which is based off of the heroic figure from the time of Troy and the Trojan War, Aeneas, legendary figure that they take way back there to say this is the founder of, or the father, if you will, that ended up playing a role in the establishment of the Roman government. Aeneas, a figure named Aeneid or Aeneas in Acts chapter 9. Let me double check this. There's a video that I did with Michael Koshinosh, he was a student of Dennis MacDonald, but specifically after Paul's supposed conversion. All right, Ananias. The Lord said to Ananias, go. Okay, nope, it's not Ananias. Keep going down. Several days in Damascus. This is Aeneas. Yeah, it's Aeneas and Dorcas. But Lydia is somebody who's also there. But Aeneas, let's see. So there he found a man named Aeneas who was paralyzed and had been bedridden, for 8 years. Aeneas, Peter said to him, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and roll up your mat. Immediately Aeneas got up. All those who lived in Lydia and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Well, Michael Koshinosh, using the commentary, the works of many of the scholars, but specifically the one on Acts with what's the famous commentary on Acts, Jacob? I think
it's Richard Purvo.
Richard Purvo's. He didn't do an in-depth Aeneas word search. Like he found like maybe 5 or 6 Aeneases in all of history where that name actually is used for a person who's written anywhere. And come to find out, if I said Michael Jordan, what do you think about? What do you think about? If I said Michael Jordan, what comes to mind?
Isn't he the famous boxer?
No, Michael Jordan?
Oh, wait, not. I got him confused with someone else. Oh, yeah, the guy that's flying in space. Yeah.
No, basketball.
Oh.
Michael Jordan. But you know what?
I
In
got him
Space
mixed up
Jam,
with
he
someone else
was flying in space. So I guess you could say in a way, but he's the famous basketball player, kind of like Arnold Schwarzenegger. If I say Arnold Schwarzenegger, you think the best bodybuilder, even though there's bigger guys out there now, he's like the role model that people think. If you think of Tiger Woods, you think of the best golfer, right?
Yeah.
You could come up with any name. I don't care. You might disagree with the name I bring up, but I'm sure we might agree somewhere along the line of a name of someone who represents, they're like a legend that represent a certain theme, certain sport, certain topic, whatever it might be. Einstein. Oh, relativity, science. Oh, okay. So you think of Einstein, you automatically do that. There were probably brighter people in Einstein's day than Einstein, but he seems to be the legendary name that comes up when you're thinking of relativity or whatever it might be. Now, I say that to say Aeneas, when in the ancient world you said Aeneas, what comes to mind? Rome. And as John Dominic Crossan said so eloquently on our channel when I recorded him, he said, Luke Acts, he thinks, is definitely the same author. He thinks that Acts is a kind of like there's 2 volumes of work here with Josephus, same author, 2 volumes of work. He says in Luke, you have from Galilee to Jerusalem. In Acts, you have from Jerusalem to Rome. So they want to take over the whole empire. And the message is that the Holy Spirit is going from Galilee to Rome, but it goes through Jerusalem on the way, which is why after the resurrection, he has them stay in Jerusalem. But in the earlier Gospels, it's like, go to Galilee. They're trying to get away from Galilee. And he points out that Christianity would not have survived if it remained in Galilee. You hear the name Aeneas in chapter 9, as Michael Koshinoff says, you think of Rome. So the whole point of the name even being brought up, he says, is probably fiction. Because next thing you know, Peter is having a vision and he's running from God, so to speak. He's doing another Jonah, where he is in the same port, Joppa, as Jonah did. Then he gets a vision, and God brings down these animals in the vision saying, do not call unclean what I have called clean. So he literally is riffing off of the Old Testament as well as the Greek world to make his point. And it's fun. I love this stuff. So if you haven't checked it out, Wheat Passages, read. You can get the whole thing for like 30, 40 bucks, I think, on Amazon. All 3 books. Really cool. They're colorful. They're fun to look at, but they're better to read.
Brady Goodwin, thank you for your super chat. Derek, I appreciate
Brady.
your example of following the evidence where it seems to lead, even if it means publicly changing your position. Jacob, great job. What is the most insightful interview you've done thus far, and why? That's a very tough question. I mean, there's a lot of really good interviews out there on the channel.
My scholar friends are watching. They're probably going to get mad at me. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know.
Let's start with you. What's
the most insightful interview I've done? Gosh, that's a hard one, Brady. I mean, I won't. One day I'll probably. What? You got something?
It's me, Brady. The most insightful interview he's ever done is with me. Duh.
I knew Derek was going to do some stuff like that. That's a very hard one. I don't think I'm going to be correct and accurate in this. I would have to say, if I'm being fair, the most methodical scholar in terms of the way they presented and took me through the evidence of arguing their point to this day. It's hard. Notice I'm having a struggle here, but I'm just trying to be honest in what I think about this. Steve Mason is the most methodical, patient, and work you through the arguments. That's how I'm taking insightful here to define based on the super chat. But there's so many, and it depends on what you're looking for. Like, if you want to understand how... What? Steve Mason? Yeah, Steve Mason's a boss. I don't know, man. They're all badasses. So if you
I agree.
Yeah, it's hard for me to...
You know, I must admit, I was even thinking thinking of Steve Mason, but I don't actually have a real answer to this question. I don't have an answer.
I tried. I did try to answer it. Brady, thank you so much for real.
Yes, I really appreciate that super chat. Whisk, thank you for your super chat. He says, thank you both of you for all you do. Off topic, but thoughts on a pre-Christian form of revelation. I guess I'll go first. Yeah, I've heard arguments of like this. I know that James Tabor believes in something like this too, that there was a proto-revelation out there. I find the mention of the 7 years, that there'll be turmoil on the earth for 7 years. When the Antichrist comes, he's going to rule for 7 years, and then the end times begin. Jesus is going to come down, something like that. But the 7 years, I'm not alone on this. Others have pointed this out, that 7 years sounds to me like the 7-year Jewish revolt. And if this was something written in the 2nd century CE, I guess that's possible. But to me, that part could go back to 70. Maybe. That's really all I can say. I really don't have much more of a position than that.
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to this question. I know Dennis McDonald also has pointed out that I guess within some of the scholars on this, that there are some who say this, some who don't. So I really don't have any thoughts because I haven't done a deep examination on pre-Christian form of revelation. I don't really know what to make of that. I have read Adela Yarbrough Collins' book.
Yeah.
And the battle, what is it? Revelation, combat myth of Revelation or something. But yeah, I've read that, and it's really interesting how she shows there's differences that are happening between certain chapters to the next. So how they compiled this material is really, really strange. I don't really know the answer to this question, and I don't really have a thought on it yet because I haven't studied it. Whiskey, thank you.
I need to correct myself for one moment there. I meant to say 73 CE, not 70. But let's get to the next one. Jack Bull, Thank you for your super chat. What do you think of Marcion priority, Gospels and New Testament?
You want me to answer that?
I guess you can go first. Yeah.
So I have not examined this and studied this a lot. I know this is something that you've been discussing on your channel more. Of course, I don't think I've really talked about this much. The only times this kind of discussion has come up is maybe when Litwa came on to discuss, dating of Luke and talking about how Irenaeus is, pretty much saying, oh, no, Marcion, he added to, and like, or maybe he took away, I'm sorry, like he's cutting out stuff that we had in our gospel. Who to believe, right? Irenaeus or Marcion, right? This is the question. And scholars fall on both sides of what the answer to this question is. And I don't really know. I really don't know. I think there's something Marcus Vincent, I heard through the grapevine, is doing really good work, at least saying what we have. There may be some conflation in the material, because by the time we get it into canonized form, you know how we talk about Marcion priority and stuff? I do think Mark priority. I do think that Mark, came earliest. It's got the least mythological and developed stuff. Like, would you really have Jesus look crazy in Mark? Would you really go out of your way not to incorporate what you see in Matthew and Luke? I don't think so. The point is that once you get this canon, though, like, these scribes may have conflated some of the material from other gospels. And we see this happen in later scribal traditions where, like, you find the birth narrative and then you find something that looks like it's Mark or it's Luke, and they find it in another book. And Marcus Vincent seems to be highly critical in saying, before we have this Irenaeus stamped canon as they want it to be, or they start to make it into, they're already kind of conflating material. So I don't really know the answer to this question when it comes to Marcion priority, though. I'm open to anything, really.
I prefer to call it Lordian priority because I don't think Marcion wrote it. The Gospel of the Lord. I agree with Matthias Klinghardt that Marcion didn't write this. I think Mark was aware of it, but I think he made minimal use of it. I think he was more concerned with earlier Jewish sources, because I agree with James Edwards, Bride Young, and David Flusser that there were Jewish texts that we lost that did talk about Jesus before 70. And I think the Hellenistic New Testament, as it really is heavily Hellenized, is responding to this Jewish literature. And I think they're Hellenizing Jesus. Like, let's talk about Romans 9. In Romans 9, I think Paul was aware of a tradition, perhaps a written text, of a genealogy of Jesus that goes back to the patriarchs. And, there's a text that in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, a lot of church fathers mention Hebrew Matthew. Now, they're not saying, just so we don't mix things up here, they're not saying Greek Matthew was a translation of Hebrew Matthew. Several church fathers were concerned. As a matter of fact, they heavily criticized Hebrew Matthew. And they often said, Hebrew Matthew's a problem because it presents a Jesus that we don't like. Like, this guy is pro-circumcision, pro-Torah. And this is Epiphanius saying this. Jerome and Eusebius make similar statements too. And they're saying, this Hebrew stuff is like a Nazarene Ebionim situation here, not a Christian text. Some scholars, many scholars actually, will say, I don't buy Hebrew Matthew, but I'm like, well, I don't think the church made it up either, because that's kind of strange that you go out of your way to make up a document, criticize it, and say this is a problem. Yeah, I think this is, in my view, I'm confident this is a pre-70 text. I think the Gospels were aware of it, but I think it was heavily overwritten. The problem is we don't have a manuscript. It's mentioned many, many, many times, even as far back as Papias, but we don't have a manuscript. We don't know what this text exactly looks like. But the church fathers, some of them that looked at it, have said, yeah, this is a very pro-Torah Jesus we've got in here. And they say, this has got to be, we got to call this a heretical document. We can't have this. So like I said earlier about Paul, the claim that Paul has made up the crucifixion. It's so why would Paul create a problem for him to deal with? Just like, right. Why would the church fathers, in the same token, make up a Hebrew Matthew that contradicts their portrayal of Jesus and then criticize it. I find that hard to believe.
Yeah. Thank you, Jack.
Yeah. Michael Apple, thank you for your super chat. Derek, you are now comparing Jesus to Aeneas, Prince of
Aeneas.
Troy. Aeneas, sorry, Prince of Troy. Okay, I still don't think Ditto was written as Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, I'm not comparing Jesus to Aeneas. I'm suggesting that Aeneas is actually the Roman fiction, foundation fiction to their establishment as a kingdom, as a with the Caesars ruling and such. Because later in Virgil, which wrote the Aeneid, this one's translated by Robert Fagles, but Virgil wrote this, and he actually goes out of his way propagandistically to make Caesar Augustus and Julius Caesar born with portents and divine, like, it's not about Aeneas that we're comparing it to. It's the story of Aeneid, in which I would say the story of Acts is comparable. And it's actually trying to rival it in competitive ways to make Jesus the Son of God, not Caesar Augustus, to make Jesus the one who's going to rule a kingdom forever, not the Julio-Claudian line. And so that's the comparison. I'm not saying put Jesus here and then put Aeneas here. I'm simply saying in the story of Acts, the person who's named Aeneas pops up in Acts chapter 9, right after Paul's, we like to call it conversion, but I'm just going to call it his turning toward Christ. And next thing you know, what do we have? We have Aeneas pop up, and that name brings Rome to mind. So the mission is Rome. It's Rome, baby. We're going to take over Rome. That's the whole goal. So that's all I was doing. I'm not saying that Jesus was Aeneas or comparing him in any identical way or anything like that. But I think it's more along the lines of Caesar Augustus, the Julio-Claudian line, and saying Jesus is the real king who's going to rule a kingdom with peace, Pax Romana, right? The real peace, not this nonsense that these guys are doing. Or they're not derogatory toward Rome. If anything, they're playing along with Rome to try and, I would say, subvert that. So that was my point. Thank you for that super chat.
Yeah, the comparison between Jesus to Aeneas is interesting. But yeah, I think people take it too far when they say stuff. And there's literally, I've seen some guy, no offense to him, but this is probably one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. There's this guy going around on multiple videos claiming that Jesus is Nero. I'm like, okay, I can't help you. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
But okay, I guess Jesus persecuted his own movement. That makes sense. Yeah, that's the ticket. Max the Confessor again, man, super chatting a lot today.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks again. Derek, Hellenism is real. I'm making a historical case for Jason and the Argonauts in the Journal for Philosophy of Religion. Undesigned coincidences.
Oh, wow. Undesigned coincidences. I've heard that one before. Making a historical case for Jason and the Argonauts in the Journal of Philosophy of Religion. That'll be interesting. I definitely think Hellenism is, I'm kind of wondering what you mean by real, but I think that Hellenism's completely saturated the entire world within that Roman Empire and probably even beyond its own borders. There's a bunch happening there. So Jews were highly Hellenistic. Even the ones that were trying to fight against the Hellenism were being Hellenized. So they had to work within models of Hellenism in order to even combat their Hellenistic opponents. So everybody's Hellenized. But yeah, thank you, Max. Really appreciate that. Email me when you write what you're writing. I'll be interested to see what you're trying to make a case for.
Yeah, same here. Email me too. I'm interested.
Thank you, Max.
Got another one right here. Lysander again. Thanks for another super chat. Paul doesn't know an earthly Jesus. He calls Peter, etc., apostles. He doesn't place them in the Last Supper story. Paul doesn't know them as disciples.
Yeah, so this is the idea of apostles and disciples are two different words. 1 Corinthians 11 is what we need to look at here, right? So it doesn't list it doesn't name any of the people at the Last Supper or the Lord's Supper. So in the following derivatives, I have no praise for you for your meetings do more harm than good in the first place. So he's rebuking them at the church in Corinth. And there's all sorts of infighting. Who gets favorite seating? The poor are going to bed hungry. The rich are getting drunk and not, they have plenty to eat. So then you come together. It's not the Lord's Supper you eat. For when you're eating, some of you go ahead. Okay. For I received. Now, this is the interesting thing. Robin Faith Walsh thinks that this is not a tradition handed down by other disciples. She believes that Paul concocted this himself. And it's interesting to hear her say the Lord's Supper here. And here's why, the way that she understands this. Paul says in 23, 1 Corinthians 11, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. So she takes that to mean what it says. She says, this is something that Paul receives from Christ. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So then whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord is unworthy in an unworthy manner, will be guilty of sinning against the body and the blood of the Lord. All right. This is the interesting thing. He's rebuking them. He's arguing about how they're treating the Lord's Supper. Then all of a sudden, Paul has this revelation. He says, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. Robin thinks that this is directly from his Jesus, his resurrected Jesus that's giving him this revelation. The interesting part about this is when Jesus says, this is my body, which is for you, the question is, who is the you here that Jesus is talking to? Is Paul making this up? Is he, as I think Robin might be trying to imply, that Paul is saying that the resurrected Jesus told him, hey, Paul, this is what happened to me the night before I got crucified, and was God handed me over and for me to be crucified. This is what happened. So Paul's kind of saying, this is what Jesus told me. And it's not absurd to think that someone would make something up. I mean, you could say it's true or you could say it's made up, because some people who've investigated Islam and looked at Muhammad might say, hey, Muhammad saw I think it was his nephew, his wife, who's really, really pretty, caught her naked, saw her naked in some of the stories. And next thing you know, he gets a revelation from God, like, hey, it's okay. You can marry her. And the nephew, I think it was, came and said, hey, you should marry my wife. If Allah's, willing that you should be with her, I'll divorce her and then you can marry her. And sure enough, according to the story, and I think this is in later tradition, of course, he ends up marrying the woman. The point is, notice how quick you can get a revelation when you want to convey a message. Hey, I want that pretty girl. Or, hey, you Corinthians aren't listening. You're creating more disturbance at the Lord's Supper. Oh, you know what? The Lord told me. The Lord told me that this is what happened. He did this for you. And the fact that you're not doing the Lord's Supper right, you're shaming the Lord's, death and body and his blood and whatnot. You better cut that shit out. Excuse my French. But you get what I'm saying? Like, yeah. So is Paul making this up? Probably. And I don't know. I mean, we don't have a time machine, right? But if you act like this came from Jesus and this is really from the historical guy, you might want to stop being dogmatic, because we don't know. We don't know. Just don't know how to put it. But look, a few chapters later, I'm sorry, I just emphasizing.
Okay.
1 Corinthians 15, right? A few chapters later, remember I told you the trope of appearances. He says, now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you the gospel I preached to you, which you received, on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I have received, I passed on to you as first of importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and after that he appeared to. This could be trope. This could be legendary in terms of the appearance narrative, having these eyewitness testimonies as part of the legendary trope that we find with Romulus and other figures. The thing is, you do have these other people like Cephas, the 12. Paul says in Galatians he needs to go to them. Why does he need to go to them? Obviously, they have some clout. They have to have some importance in the tradition in the early church, whatever that is. So So I would say that if he is making stuff up, he's kind of sprinkling in real people into his legendary trope on Christ. I don't really know where to be too dogmatic on that at all.
I think that, and the next super chat's hilarious, but before I get to that one, I think I suspect Paul was probably aware of a passion narrative not anywhere near as sophisticated as the four gospels we've got, that has a Eucharist in it. Because the Eucharist is also in our gospels too. So I suspect he probably knew a proto passion narrative, you want to call it that. Or I don't know, the peace source. It is actually a peace source of the Old Testament, but let's make one up for the New Testament too, I guess. Seth Heidick, thank you for your super chat. Hope I pronounced your last name right. Was Paul a full-on George Santos?
Oh my gosh, Seth, thank you for that super chat.
Yeah, that's that analogy is gold. Well, I don't know if it's that bad, but at the same time, though, Paul does say a couple of times in his letters, I think it's in 1 Corinthians, definitely in Galatians, I'm not a liar. And in Galatians, he goes on to state, I'm all things to all men. To those that are under the law, I'm under the law. To those that are not under the law, I'm not under the law. It sounds like a fence sitter that's like, okay, I tell everybody on this side of the fence, I believe they're right. I tell everybody on the other side of the fence, they're right too. And it sounds like a statement from my point of view that Paul is trying to appease everybody. That's just me. And it is obviously dishonest.
I think so. I mean, or you could interpret it that way because the way that Robin Walsh was saying, and I'm only quoting the most recent scholar that I've encountered with this, she thinks there's two tracks. The Jews are fine and they're safe within. They don't need to go through this Christ thing like Gentiles do. So I was like, hold on, what? Hold on, you're taking like, there seems to be almost like two tracks here. Jews, fine. Gentiles, you need this, is how she's kind of interpreting it. But it's like Paul is trying to straddle both worlds, and it's clear he's trying the best he can to become all things to all of them. I don't think he meant anything bad by that, or he wouldn't have said it.
No.
But the way it seems clear to us is like, dude, you got an agenda here of trying to.
I think it fits perfectly. I hope I didn't interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I think it fits perfectly when he says, I'm not a liar, because there are people calling him a liar, but at the same time, he's saying that he appeases everybody. So I think that does jive together pretty well. And it's not super bad, I guess, but it doesn't look good.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, just all I can say on that.
Hey, real quick, Abu Hana in the chat. I think this is real quick. Just says, actually, Derek, you've got it all backwards. Muhammad didn't want to marry her as it was taboo. And then we'll get the super chat. So timing was right. Muhammad didn't want to marry her as it was taboo in pre-Islamic Arabia. He only married her because God commanded it. Could be. Just painting a narrative here, I have no time machine, but if you saw a very pretty girl's naked body in the tent, let's just say, and then all of a sudden, it wasn't long after this that you married her, I don't care what anyone is just saying in a text, especially if it's embarrassing. I'm going to go, you saw something you liked and made it happen somehow, but then they're writing it as if you didn't want it. I'm not going to say it couldn't be the other way around. It's just more likely I'm a human. I know how humans think and how they act. And if you saw that, a naked younger girl, and you're into that, like, it seems more likely you're marrying her with that driving you, if that makes sense. But I mean, I have no time machine, and neither do they. But maybe I need to examine the text again and try to look at it. But hard for me to believe that someone's going to turn down. I don't want to marry her. I know I just saw her naked and she looked like a really hot model there in the tent. I don't know. It's hard for me to think you're just going to be in denial. But then you do end up marrying her. That's tough. But I don't know. I'd have to look at the material. I was told that she was naked. I need to look at that material myself. But don't know. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it. But I'm just trying to point out, if that were the case, You could see why people would come up with a revelation.
Mike 8903, thank you for your super chat. Why would it be so unbelievable to Paul's audience that he felt the need to say, "I do not lie," in reference to seeing James in the flesh?
Why would it be so unbelievable to Paul's audience that he felt the need to say, "I do not lie," in reference to seeing James? My guess. I was going to say my guess, and this is from the Steve Mason interview that I did on Paul. We're dealing with kind of a half telephone conversation in Paul's letters. And on the other side, if we ask, why has he got to swear and be like, no, I'm telling you, I saw James in the flesh. And then, nobody else, or the one time he saw Cephas and nobody else. I can't remember exactly how the phrase goes in Galatians, but is he needs clout. He needs these guys to be somehow a stamp of approval for his gospel, because he's getting accused. And one of the accusations I think he's getting in Galatians is your message, your gospel is a man-pleasing gospel, meaning you're trying to make it easy on people. Don't worry about circumcision. Don't worry about Sabbath. Don't worry about dietary. You can come and do what you keep doing. Just worship one God. That's it. And the accusation from those who are Judaizing are saying, what the heck? You're cutting the heart out of our entire inheritance and everything that was given to God's people. You're doing this just to satisfy these Gentiles who don't want to clip the tip of their dicks off. So he literally is trying to please these people. That seems to be the accusation. So he wants to go to people that are somewhat of noteworthy, saying, I went to James, I went to Peter, and guess what? They told me you're good to go. But then he has to backtrack and go even above that and say, oh, I had to let Cephas know to his face. Like he is even better than these guys. So he's already trying to build up a reputation for himself that he's not a man-pleasing. This is all from God. I'm only doing this because of God and the truth. And, maybe he thinks that. I can't read his mind. I have no time machine. But there seems to be also a motivated factor of income that needs to come in through these people and his work. So you could say someone really believes in things and are delusional, and combine that with the fact that they also need that money to be fed, to make sure that they have a place, to make sure that people are paying for their travel. Paul is absolutely relying on people to pay for him in his trips. So he needs his entourage and people he's writing to be on his side. He needs that, but he also might be delusional at the same time with the kind of beliefs that he has.
Seth Heideck, another super chat. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Paul was Jewish, with a laughing, crying emoji. Yeah, I kind of get why you put that there, because, okay, he's obviously not Torah Orthodox.
Right.
That's definitely clear.
Well, I would say he's Hellenistic.
Yeah.
Did you watch that John Collins interview I did last on Paul? What he means by the law and all of that?
The last interview I saw was of him, was you and him talking about the Old Testament and him talking about Joshua's conquest possibly being a remodeling of the Syrian conquest. But
yeah.
So I don't recall this one.
The latest one that I did with him was on Paul. And he's not a Pauline expert, but he knows enough to really get into it. And he says Paul is highly Hellenistic. And it seems historically that there is an issue in the Hellenized world outside of, Jerusalem, right? So in the Hellenized world, people, what they meant by the law, there seems to have been competing ideas of what is meant by the law, how far one is willing to take it. Dude, hold on. You got to wash your hands 19 times before you can even eat your food with your fork. They're arguing over that kind of minutia. And in the Hellenized world, there seems to be a much more relaxed approach. It's the spirit of the law, not the literal chill. It's not this extreme detail that you see argued in the Gospels as well. So I don't know, when it says he's a Pharisee, I don't know how far to take this. I've had some people say He's trying to argue that he is as extreme about this and his religion as Pharisees are. I've had some people say, no, he was an actual Pharisee. Most people think that. But what does it mean to be Hellenized and in an educated Hellenistic world and be a Pharisee? Are there different versions of Pharisees? Probably. And could you have gone to school, become a Pharisee, and became extremely Hellenized? And there are certain more strict in Jerusalem Pharisees that would have argued with other Pharisees. I imagine it's like today. If you say you're a Republican or Democrat, not getting into politics,
Right.
not all of them agree. I'm just saying, not even all within that camp
Exactly.
agree with each other over the details. So I imagine the same could be said of people who are within the Jewish camp. But I do think he was Jewish. If the joke in the super chat was he's like Jew-ish, like, is he a Jew? I think he was Jewish, but I think our understanding, if you're a Jew, that you need to be like Torah observant law, like you brought up, like that's our first inclination, because we've had these binary categories about Jew, law observant, a Hellenized Jew. You're not really a Jew. No, there's like a flux of various Hellenistic Jews that are out there, and some may be more strict on the more Essene and legal about their stuff, and then others that are far more open to the Hellenized world. And it's not like one size fits all. That's my thoughts. Sorry.
Seth Heideck, another super chat. Really appreciate it, man. Really do.
Jacob's going to be inviting me a lot more onto his. So, Derek, what are you doing tomorrow?
Paul was an all-star volleyball player at Beirut University.
Oh, Seth. Oh, man. Thank you.
Maybe he would have been if he lived today.
He does use a lot of sports language. He talks about running the race, Philippians, and he talks about getting the wreath at the end, running the race and getting the wreath. He talks about the gymnasium type stuff. So maybe Paul's over there in the gymnasium watching these naked Greeks playing volleyball and going, man, I'm going to write like I'm a volleyball player, but I'm not really a volleyball player. Being silly here, but no, he knows about the gymnasium. He seems to be into sports. He's an educated guy. Paul is an educated guy. He went to university in some way, shape, or form. I really do think that, meaning the ancient schools. In some way, he's educated. Gamaliel, I'm not so convinced. I'd say that that's fiction to make the point that this is an educated guy. I don't think that I would historically depend on that, but I would say this guy definitely was smart. He knew his philosophy. And of course he had a new thing, this Christ stuff. So,
but speaking of volleyballs, he's definitely tap dancing around one when it comes to the crucifixion of who killed Jesus.
That is yeah. Getting to your point earlier though, Jacob, would he have said, oh, the Romans crucified our Lord? I mean, remember, he speaks in code. So, would he say that? Well, I mean, would he be like so clear and, oh, it was these guys, it was Romans who did this, damn Romans? No. If he wants to keep his head, and if he wants to keep getting people in the Roman Empire as his patrons, I don't know if he'd be so blatant. But I also wonder, when you mentioned archons as humans,
yes,
I'm more in the Elaine Pagel's camp that it's both. So I think that it's
actually, I didn't clarify my statement. I agree with that too.
Because
the way Paul says it is that heavenly forces are conspiring with earthly archons,
right,
to have Jesus killed. And when you look at the Gospel of Mark, I think Mark knew all the Pauline epistles. I think like he's trying to combine different viewpoints, like 1 Timothy, Jesus confessed before Pilate. 1 Thessalonians, Jews killed Jesus. 1-2 Corinthians, heavenly forces alongside archons conspired to kill Jesus. So Mark kind of blends it together. Jews forced Pilate to kill Jesus, as Satan was behind it. It's like it's combining all those points together into one story, in my view.
So I don't know. I don't know how that all works out. I'm not so sure. And I do think he knows Paul. Mark, I don't have too much confidence, but I get what you're saying. I see how that could make sense in your view. For me, just putting it simply in the Gospel of Mark, you see when Peter literally makes what James Tabor calls a false confession. He literally says, "You are the Christ," after he says, "Who do men say that I am?" And then 2 verses later, I think it's 2 or 3, it's in the same context. Jesus turns to Peter after Peter, he tells him, "Hey, I'm going to die." Right? You guys said I'm the Christ, right? Well, I'm going to die, because this is the model that Mark wants you to see the Messiah as, one who's going to die. Peter goes, "No, Lord." And then Jesus turns to Peter and says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." So Peter is Satan? No. The spirit behind, the entity behind this man's idea of the Messiah doesn't go to die.
I never interpret that as Peter being Satan.
No. I'm implying for our audience to kind of tack on with what I'm saying is, here's a human that the author of Mark is trying to say that Jesus is saying has the power of Satan behind him in what he's saying. So like, get behind me. Like, no, this is not of God. So I do think, just like any Pentecostal or like spiritual Christian today who probably watches my channel and leaves a comment, or your channel and leaves a comment, Jacob is possessed by Satan. There's no reason he would ever say such a thing if the demons were not, like, they think there's some spiritual world that's causing, or spirits that are causing you or me to have our eyes covered and don't believe or whatever. So I think it's both, but I definitely wouldn't just say it's only archons. And even if Paul was saying it, he meant archons as in like spiritual beings. Even if he meant, hey, the spirits are this, they are the ones who did this, doesn't mean they weren't using humans to do it. So it's kind of one of those things. I don't know.
No more super chats so far.
Okay.
But yeah, I appreciate those super chats so far. I got a lot of them today. But yeah, I want to go back to that First Timothy thing real quick. Regardless of the position of Paul wrote it or not, let's just pretend for a moment he did write it.
Mm-hmm.
Even in First Timothy, it doesn't even go out of its way to blame Pilate for the death of Jesus. It says Jesus confessed before Pilate, but it won't go all the way and say that Pilate ordered his death. It won't. So even though it's got Pilate in there, it doesn't go all the way with him. I definitely don't think Mark only had Paul's letters. I think I agree with scholars like Bartos, Adamczewski, Marcus Vincent, and others, Samuel Zenner, that Mark had access to Josephus just like Luke Acts did.
Right.
So I think Mark had Josephus. He probably saw the testimonium, and I think Mark had access to Jewish sources that probably told a more Jewish viewpoint about the crucifixion of Jesus, that most certainly would have blamed the Romans, blamed Pilate. It wouldn't be tiptoeing around it like Paul does. It'd be really, really clear. And that's probably why those documents don't survive anyway. But, I mean, there could have been some there could have been some documents about Jesus that were in the temple that were destroyed during the war. I don't know. Can't prove it. But it's not insane to think that could be the case. Max the Confessor again. Thanks for another super chat.
Max.
Ralph Ellis. Satan equals Peter. 5 letters with T in the middle. Taylor Swift starts with T. T looks like a cross. Swift is a mythological space messiah.
Oh my gosh, Max. I think Max honestly just hit the nail on the head. I think we're all wrong. Ralph is right here. Max, thank you so much. Jeez, now I have something to wrap my head around. It didn't make sense until this super chat. 5 letters with T in the middle. Taylor Swift starts with T. Come on. Who's had posters of Taylor Swift on their wall? Come on. And T looks like a cross. You can't get any clearer than this. Swift is a mythological space messiah. Dude, Max, your logic is impeccable.
Before we close out, I just want to say one more thing. I can't wait for Ralph's next book on the Alamo, if he ever writes one. He's going to prove that the Jewish Roman War happened in Mexico, and that Troy, the Alamo, and Jerusalem are the same place, and Cortez and Santillana is Vespasian. That's all I have to say.
Hey, John D in the chat. If Mark is the gospel pleader, why does Mark make Peter an idiot who literally denies Christ? This is a great point. I don't even need to answer it because this is the point.
No.
If anything, the church would have done themselves a favor by saying, okay, look, Mark was a companion of Paul. They messed up when they made him a companion of Peter and they're all dim-witted. They don't get it. So the whole time they don't get it. And the closest you would think is good is really bad because he turns around and rebukes him and says, Satan, get behind me. Matthew takes that out and makes it all positive and praiseworthy. Like, oh, well, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, Peter, but my Father in heaven. Great point. Anyway, Jacob, I really appreciate you inviting me, man. And
yeah, I appreciate you coming on. This was great.
You have a great audience out there watching. A great bunch of funny super chats came in, and I do appreciate your time.
Yeah, I just want to take a moment to thank everybody that super chatted their questions. I really appreciate the support. It really helps me keep going here. And don't forget, if anybody here hasn't subscribed to Derek's channel, please do. He's got a lot of great content there too. Thanks again, Derek.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Just be looking out for more, of course. If you haven't decided, if you wanted to try and help support somebody, go help Jacob out. You have your Patreon. Of course, you can help out through the super chats. To keep growing this empire. We're trying to bring the scholarship to the general public. We've got courses coming out. Jacob, you'll be promoted some of those, of course.
Yeah,
and if you're watching Jacob, you're a fan of History Valley, the way you can help him, Patreon, Super Chat, buy the courses that he's going to be pumping out there. It helps him out. So help Jacob out. Let's keep this thing going and keep digging. I love this.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.